We have an absolutely tremendous presenter for you today. Yes. A lovely gentleman by the name of Mark Hylkema, standing over here, is the archaeologist for state parks, and I actually got to spend a work day with Mark yesterday and see him in action, and he is a totally awesome guy who is doing totally awesome work in our own backyard here at San Mateo County Coast. So I do want to give Mark as much time as possible to tell you guys all about the Ohlone that lived here, as well as the Mexican land grant and Spanish era of the coastside. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Hylkema.
Greetings. I made it.
How did you do it?
That is a miracle of God. I have 32 parks in my jurisdiction for cultural resources, and I live in Sunnyvale. So it doesn't matter where I go, and it's always a commute, you know?
What's the range? How far apart is it?
From the Monterey County line to San Francisco. So it's the best job on the planet, actually. I have no staff, no budget. But it works great. I have a lot of graduate students from various universities helping me out with projects. In fact, in the past 3 years, we've turned out 8 PhDs from UC Berkeley and UC Santa Cruz on projects in parks. So I'm very proud of that because state parks is a public institution. They're your parks. And so my job is to steward those resources. And the resources I manage range from industrial sites like lime kilns and ranches to Mission Santa Cruz to Pigeon Point Lighthouse, hundreds of Native American sites, shipwreck cemeteries, and it goes on and on. And you know, they don't teach you that in school. Those are things you have to learn in the field. So I've been doing this for 38 years now professionally. 18 years with parks, 11 years with Caltrans. I still have the CT stamped on my forehead. Because that agency, you don't go around the archaeology, you go through it. So, you know, I have a long history with that. But my specialty is Native American culture. I started learning about tribal California before I became an archaeologist. In my younger years, I was neighbors with Ohlone descendants and went on to other places in California to learn about Native American culture. When I was 20 years old, I got adopted in a Lakota family. There were 6,000 Sioux in the South Bay, Plains Indians that were relocated by the U.S. government because there wasn't enough job opportunity on the reservations. So they moved them to urban centers. So there are a lot of urban Native people as well as the original people. And let me preface the conversation here by saying the Native people are still here. They never disappeared. There's this tendency to look at, you know, prehistoric, as we say, Native Americans. We know the missions were a difficult time for the Native people. And then we have this kind of idea that they just disappeared, you know, and they didn't. They have had a very traumatic history, and we'll touch on that a little bit, just so you have a context of understanding. But like my Native friends say, is we didn't disappear, you guys became many. And, right? And that's what I found out trying to drive in. I can relate because I was born and raised in Mountain View. And I remember the orchards and the oak woodlands that were in between the orchards. And so trying to calculate time for travel now has become impossible because I used to know how long it took to get to Half Moon Bay. And now I guess I don't. So, you know, that's part of our modern life now. And like the natives before us, we adapt. And so my theme of this talk is actually multifaceted because I speak in parallels. I don't have a script, but I have a show which keeps me sort of on target. And it does take me a while to get through it because I'm going to talk to you about 14,000 years of Native American heritage in about 2 hours. So buckle up, we're gonna go, right? And I will be happy to entertain questions, and I hope you have some, because this is a more of a general approach through the imagery, but I have a lot more specific information in here. I do teach college classes at various universities. I do that for sport, because I feel very dedicated to educating the public about what most people don't know. In parks, I do a lot of training sessions for our docents I was just here 6 days ago doing that very thing for the Half Moon Bay docents. And so why do I do that on my weekends? I have no life anymore. It's all I do. It's because I feel very strongly that we need to teach. And so that, in our case, the docents, perhaps you, as with the museum, will become the ambassadors to other people. And we need to educate because most people don't really have a clue about what Native culture was. We all have ideas we think we know, and that translates to talking to other people who start adding their lore, and you end up with a lot of mythology going on. And that's been a struggle for me, because I hear things like, oh, the ancient people were primitive. Well, we're pretty primitive too, depending on what era you want to look at, right? Or they were wild. Well, my Indian friends say, we're pretty wild. You know, or they're nomadic. They were not nomadic. We're going to see that the tribes here, there were many different polities, as we say in anthropology, self-governed communities. There were many. And this was a cosmopolitan landscape. I can put tribal names where we have city names now. And that was the distribution of tribal government in this area. It's extremely complex. California in general is complex. We had more Native Americans per square mile in California than anywhere else in North America, north of the Aztec Empire. So if you start thinking about Cherokees, Sioux, Blackfeet, Calusa, Iroquois, Mohawks, Cheyenne, you name it, California had more people than any of those groups. California also had one of the world's most complex linguistic mosaics because there were more languages spoken here than anywhere else on the planet. And I don't say that lightly. It speaks to the diversity of the land, its ability to attract different people over millennia. We see a lot of migrations of people. And here's another thing the public doesn't often know. They're not one people. There are many different people, different ethnicities. It's a very complex situation. So that as an archaeologist, I know that each valley, each river terrace has its own culture history. And that's what keeps me kind of going, actually, is the complexity of it all. Or we put our pens down and we're done. You know, we've already learned it, we're done. No, there's still much to learn about each area. The realm of archaeology that I'm involved with now is more about learning about context of environment. We've kind of broken away from objects and artifacts as our momentum to classify cultures. We're now looking at the environment because we have so many new techniques. Some of these the PhDs I mentioned, those guys are smart. And I get to sit back knowingly and stroke my beard and go, oh, that's very interesting. But they come up with this really high-tech information and approach to the archaeology, which I'll relate throughout the conversation. A lot of the archaeology is being done through a microscope now because we don't want to excavate these sites up. They're not infinite resources, they're finite. And archaeology is disruptive as a process. It's like doing an autopsy on a patient. You take a section out, you study it, and that's what you got, but it doesn't go back. And the patient doesn't get well. It's gone forever. Once it's gone, that window shuts. Nowadays, we're looking at climate issues. That's become quite a conversation. Is it or isn't it, right? You read the debates, and I work with a lot of these specialists now because the archaeology serves as punctuated points in time that we can evaluate past environments and climate. And so we're doing that right now on a large scale. I work with a lot of biologists because the archaeological sites contain the dietary refuse of the native people, and the diet reflects the land, the animals, the plants, the shellfish, all of that is boiling down into the archaeological sites because the native people are on top of that pyramid, that food chain. And so they become mirrors of a larger landscape through the archaeology. But it requires special technique to do that. I also partner with native people. The days of going out rogue and doing whatever we like are over. We consult with tribal people in our approaches to see if they're equitable and not offensive. Because for a long time, we didn't ask. We just did what we did. And so now we've learned a little bit about how to comport ourselves because we're anthropologists first. We study native peoples through the lens of our own culture. And we've learned, because they put a mirror up for us to look at, and say, you know, the questions we ask are actually conditioned by our own culture. And so we get a certain myopic view. Does that make sense to you guys? It's okay, because I'm going to speak to you casually. We're now friends together, okay? So, yeah, so I'm not always the most politically correct, but that stuff we'll all be forgiving, right? Okay, so in any case, I'm talking about Native people and their place in the environment with an idea to be specific to the Half Moon Bay area here. And Half Moon Bay was an economic sphere in ancestral Native American culture, part of a much larger scene. So let's take a look at that. Anthropologists like to talk about beginnings. You know, I was born and raised, like I say, in California. I can remember oak woodlands, you know, where there are now housing tracts. And it's so quick, easy for people today to think of Native people as something from the geologic department, you know, something other than people that are still here. And ancient California is just around us still. It's going fast, but there is still a lot of old California around. There are a lot of Native people that still perform traditional ceremonies, not for you, but for themselves, to maintain the balance of the world as Creator required them to do from day one. They're still trying to fulfill their obligation to the spirit of their role to the land and the people. So they're here. They still speak, many of their languages are still intact. And so that dichotomy between yesterday and today is still active here. And it's just invisible to us, I think. So my goal is to highlight culture so maybe it will be less invisible to you. All right. So with that in mind, archaeologists are scientists. And so we look at origins of people. All cultures have a story of Genesis, where we come from. How did we come to be? And stories are meant to be fluid. They're told from oral traditions, you know, from generation to generation. Some cultures end up getting scribal and writing their origins down, and then it becomes fixed. It's no longer fluid, and the moral of the story is lost, and it's the literate word that becomes important, not the story as much. And I think that in Native cultures, it is a fluid tradition. So archaeology tends to be more stodgy. We're more fundamentalist in our own way, because we look at where people came from. We have DNA and radiocarbon dating to help back up our hypotheses. And Native people just go, you know, whatever. Because we talk about the migrations of people into the Americas and when that occurred. And Native people will tell us, well, we didn't come from anywhere else. We've always been here. And the archaeologist in me goes, well, that's quaint, and that's pretty nice. You know, but we know that there were migrations into the Americas, multiple migrations over time. And my tribal friends finally set me straight on this idea of them always having been here. They said, well, the water runs over the hills, through the rocks, it picks up the minerals, the water's got the minerals in it. That's timelessness, and we drink that. It becomes our body. We eat the foods, the animals that browse the grasses, that eat the grass that grows from the earth. And therefore, we are what we eat. So we are as timeless as this place. We are this place. And then I start to understand it a little more. Their perception is that they've always been here because that's what their embodiment is, right? So different ideologies come into play in how we come to be. So I'm going to start with their tradition and say, how did first people come to be? We don't have a lot of information on that, because one thing about the mission system is their cultures were trying to be changed. And so a lot of traditional knowledge was lost. But many of the tribes are relearning it from their elders, rediscovering themselves, and in a process of that. So let's start with this. Okay, we get the air clear. This is an elderberry clapper. The people did not have hand drums, they had bird bone whistles, and they clapped like this to keep the rhythm together. Split clapper sticks of elderberry. How do you get the elderberry straight like this? Well, you prune the tree years in advance. Then the tree grows straight shoots. Makes those clapper sticks then. Deer hoof rattle, made out of the deer toes, right? I shouldn't be doing this. This is a woman's puberty rattle. But, you know, that's what I got. Okay, so in the beginning, there was an endless sea of time. And in this endless sea of time, the cosmic beginnings was an island in the sea. And on this island were three spirit beings, coyote, eagle, and hummingbird. When Native people talk about animal spirits, they aren't talking about the four-legged animal. They're talking about his character, his behavior. You know what I mean? It's a different concept. And so in Native Californian society, coyote is a trickster, a wise guy. In fact, they distinguish coyote from old man coyote. Old man coyote was there in the beginning, a trickster, a braggart, intelligent, inventing things, smart, but always for self. Whereas hummingbird is trust, innocence, love. And the two are always fluttering around each other, the dyad of good and evil, plus, minus, good, the yin-yang of life, right? Eagle, or seer, is a messenger from that mundane world of coyote and hummingbird to the great spirit beyond, which they believe was beyond the sun. They called Esmen. The great spirit, the big holy, God, whatever you want to call that element, we put names on, they did not have. So they just refer to the spirit beyond. That they're subject to. Native people live in their church all the time. They don't check in and check out. What you say, how you behave, your actions, they're all witnessed by the spirit. And so you have to comport yourself accordingly. To make an offense will retort back. A broken arm, a tragedy, illness, that's because some offense occurred. And that's the reaction. Because the spirit world is neither good nor bad, it just is. It's both. Right? So for Native people, how they interact with each other and their environment becomes very, very prescribed. And one wonders what kind of life that might be where you're always worried about your spiritual contact, right? Constantly. So in the early beginning, coyote, the smart one, on top of the mountain, and hummingbird, the innocent one, one day the waters begin to recede. And they suddenly realize now they're no longer on an island, they're on a mountaintop. And they look down below and they see world makers creating things. Trees, shrubs, rivers are forming, things are popping up. And they're just looking down at this change going on. And hummingbird says, whoa, coyote, why don't you go down the hill, take inventory, tell me what you see. So coyote says, all right, and he goes down the hill, marches down and starts looking at all the creatures and things that are happening and takes inventory. Comes back up the mountain to report on what he's seen. Tells hummingbird there are four-legged creatures, there's swimming creatures, there's insects, there's flying things, there's plants galore. And there was one creature that vexed him and walked on two legs. And he couldn't figure out what that was. And hummingbird in his great wisdom said, well, that is a woman. That's to be your wife. You ever read Genesis? Sometimes it's kind of tricky too that way, right? We're missing some things. But in any case, so Coyote is told to marry that first woman and does. And their children become the various tribes as they spread out. Lots of coyote stories. You ever see the Roadrunner and Coyote cartoon? And Roadrunner, Coyote somehow has got an Acme missile from the catalog somewhere, and he's got the Roadrunner in sight, he's got the sight, he's tracking him with his missile, right? And he lights the fuse, and you all know what's going to happen. Kablooey! He's turned into a charred ember standing there looking at the Roadrunner, who goes, meep, meep, takes off, right? That's Coyote. For Native American people, it's the moral to the story. And so Coyote speaks that way. In the beginning, first people were poor. They were shivering out in the land. They did not know how to survive. And so Coyote eventually later teaches them how to make tools to survive. But before that, Hummingbird takes pity on these first people and says, they need fire. If they had fire, they could cook their food and be warm. And so he holds a council. And I love Native American stories. Because in a council, the trees will be there as spirit. You could have a mountain sitting there around the campfire, and they're all debating things, right? It's kind of awkward for us to envision, but there they all are. And so around the fire, Hummingbird says, the people need, the campfire says, we need to give fire to the people. And the keeper of fire was Badger. And so the council says, you need to get Badger to relinquish the fire to the people. So Hummingbird thinks about that. Well, Badger's stingy. And so Hummingbird flies over to Badger's lodge in the ground and visits. Because in Native American society, whenever you visit, the first thing people do is feed you. That's the custom. boy, I'm going to show you some pictures of foods I've gotten when you show up, and like, here you go, and like, whoa, you'll relate later. So in any case, so Hummingbird goes to Badger to ask for fire, and they go through the formalities. Badger gives him some acorn meal, and eventually Hummingbird says, well, I'd like to have a glowing ember to give to the people. And he goes, what? No. And so Hummingbird has to leave. Well, he comes back, and like all good stories, it goes on 3 times, right? And so on the 3rd time, Hummingbird comes back, and Badger goes, God, here he comes again, that pesky Hummingbird. So he throws a deer skin over the fire to hide him. Hummingbird comes in and sits down, and he sees through the hole, there's an arrow hole through the hide. And so he sees the fire below, and he goes, what's that over there? And Hummingbird dives in when Badger's looking the other way, and with his long beak, he reaches in and pulls out an ember, tucks it under his chin, and splits. He steals fire for people. That's why he has a red chin. Of course, the more vexing question, what about the green ones? I don't know. So, in any case, people get fire. Over time, California is occupied by many, many different tribal groups. My point of this conversation is to speak locally, but understand the group we call Ohlone is not an ethnicity. That's a term that was applied by Native people in the 1960s. And it came out because anthropologists were calling them Costanoans. And the anthropologists called them Costanoans because the Spaniards called them Costaños, coastal people. They just lumped them all together. And so what we know is that the group we call Ohlone ranged from Big Sur all the way over to Pacheco Pass, along the Diablo Range, and all the way here. And what we're really talking about is a language family, not politics. As we will see, in this group, there are 50 distinct tribes with 7 different languages. Their linguistic root is like Latin. You know, we have all these subgroups from it. So the word Ohlone is a term of convenience. It's a catch-all term of 50 political groups, tribes. They never knew that name before, and it means people of the West. And the word Ohlone is like the word European, or African, or Asian, right? Well, you know pretty well that in those terms there are many different languages and ethnicities contained in that. And that's what we have going on in the Bay Area, because this was one of the great population centers of North America. Who knew, right? So with that in mind, we start with the European expressions, the written literature. They tell us what they saw upon first encounters. And they're rich in information about native people. However, you have to read that data with the understanding that these are colonists here to conquer. And so what they write is through that lens and opinion, right? So you have to ferret it out. The first Europeans to come up the coast was Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo in 1542. That's just 20 years after Cortez conquers Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire. Empire like Spain. They had kings and books and astronomers and doctors. There was empire to empire. How did the Europeans conquer that empire? Well, the introduction of smallpox. And it takes down ally and enemy alike. So that has how that works. Eventually they continue west and discover this ocean here they think was kind of passive. So they call it the Pacific Ocean. And begin building ships and eventually find their way across the Pacific to Asia, which was the whole goal. Remember Christopher Columbus? You know, what was he doing? He was trying to find a way to Asia to circumvent the Silk Road with all the middlemen in the way, you know, those caravans. So he slams into the Dominican Republic, sees dark-skinned people, says, we must be in India, and names them Indians, right? So from day one, we have a problem. So in any case, Cortez comes later, and they continue to explore. They see Baja California. They name the sea between Baja and Mexico the Sea of Cortez, and continue northward, exploring. By this time, these galleons are coming from Asia, following the prevailing winds and currents. And one of the first landfalls they make is the California coast. By the time those ships make those oceanic voyages, there's a high mortality rate amongst the sailors. Food's not good, water's full of green living things, casks of dried beef may have been around the world a couple times already. Not so good. So why would sailors do this anyways? because there's a lot of money to be made from those shipments from Asia. So Spain was motivated to find a port on the California coast to provide for these sailors, because these ships would then sail south to San Blas and Acapulco, where they would unload their cargoes and go overland and so forth. So there was motivation to explore the California coast, and that's what Cabrillo does. In 1542, he sails up to San Pedro Harbor, names it such, gets to the Channel Islands, where one of the most complex social groups of native Californians live, called the Chumash. The Chumash had ocean-going canoes made out of drilled boards that they shaped and sewed together. They called tomals, which, by the way, we now know is a Polynesian introduction here. And the only people who make stitched boats are Polynesians. And in Hawaii, they stitched them together, all right? In Hawaiian, the word tomalo means to stitch. So the Chumash word for boat is tomal. So we know around the 10th century, there is an arrival in California. About the same century as when the Danes are in the East Coast to the north. You know, the Vikings are here too. Anyhow, so all of this complexity is going on. So Cabrillo sails to the Channel Islands off Santa Barbara, where there are thousands of native people. And they greet them. And he gets off his ship with his banners to claim for Imperial Spain. And he gets onto the rocks and slides on the algae, whammo, breaks his arm. All right? Bummer, because it will kill him on the voyage when it becomes gangrenous. At any rate, so first encounters. They continue north and sail offshore, and they see a point of land full of pines, and they name the bay La Bahia de los Pinos, Bay of the Pines. You hear all these sea lions barking. They name a point of land Point Lobos, after the sea wolves. They continue north, and they get all the way to Puget Sound in Washington, which is where he dies. And they see that huge inland sea, and they're going, man, this is cool. Because in those days, they thought the Atlantic and the Pacific must be connected. And that was a fuel to that fire, right? And they say, well, we claim this place, and then they leave. And they head out. So Spain learns of this place. In 1602, they send another captain, Sebastian Vizcaino, to find the same ports that Cabrillo found. And he pulls into the Bahia de los Pinos in Christmas 1601 and parks the boat and is the first to get out. And he names the bay Monterey, after the Viceroy of Mexico, the king's #2 man in the New World. Very PC thing to do for a military commander. And so now it's Monterey Harbor. He says, the heathen, sets the tone of the music, the heathen are fine-mannered people. They're feeding us, and they give them food. Imagine what a shock it must have been for those people to see these guys, bearded Spaniards with all the gear. You know what really freaked them out? Was all the cordage on the ship. Because these are fiber-based people, and they make strings and ropes by hand. So when they saw those ship ropes like that, they were like, oh, that's awesome. So, you know, they thought that was pretty good. The ship's bell, ding, 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 kept ringing it. Anyhow, cool stuff. And you know, the comportment, I always reflect on how they comport themselves. You know, how would we react if you had a backyard barbecue and UFO lands with Bigfoot piloting it? And are you going to, greet him with a hamburger? You know, or are you going to split, right in the hills? So you know what I'm saying? It had that same ability. So at any rate, Vizcaino says Monterey is a fabulous harbor, big enough to hold the imperial fleet of Spain. Well, it's not the greatest harbor, but he said it was. And that word goes all the way back to Europe, and Europeans stroke their beards and say, this is great, we now have this port, and then nothing happens. Nothing happens because now the Dutch and the French and the English are piling into the Pacific, and they're competing, and you see the whole colonial thing take root. So California is just too remote. We know more about Mars than they know about California at the time. So nothing happens for 147 years until the Russians begin coming down the coast. Because remember, Alaska was theirs. They're hunting sea otters and furs, and they're looking at a place along the California coast to establish a colony so they can grow vegetables and foods to support the hunters in the far north. Well, Spain finds out and says, wait a minute, that's ours. Well, there's nothing here. So they decide it's time to establish a foothold in Alta California, Upper California. By this time, they've gotten into New Mexico and Arizona, where they're stopped because the Apache and Navajo get horses, and they become supreme guerrilla fighters and stop the Spanish Empire from pursuing their goals any further. Baja California also has a string of Dominican missions, later Franciscans. That's another thing going on. You've got the competition of the church in the New World. Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, each one looking for a foothold in the New World. And that history is pretty fascinating, actually. So let it be said that by this time, Baja California has a string of missions. The Royal Presidio is in Loreto, which is really out there. Baja's not a happening place, really. And so they mounted an expedition in the year 1769 under command of Don Gaspar de Portola to go up the coast, find the fabulous harbor of Monterey, and establish a colony at a place called San Francisco, which for them is Point Reyes, because they don't know about the bay yet. So Portola goes marching out. He's got a couple diarists with him, Miguel Costanzo, the engineer. They have an engineer to help make the road work. They've got a bunch of Baja California Indians, and they've got these scouts under Sergeant Ortega. These are like Buffalo Bill, guys, Daniel Boone guys. They're not literate, which is too bad, because they're ahead, finding the way for the expedition, making first encounters, right? And then we also have a diarist, Padre Juan Crespi, who was one of Serra's students, all the way back in Spain. There were 3 of his students that defected with him to the New World, and they all become pioneers of the California frontier. Great stories. Juan Crespi's diary is a pleasure to read because he's really articulate and literate and never says anything bad about anybody. He'll just ignore them and not write about them at all if he doesn't like them. Anyway, so they head up the coast and they say farewell to Loreto, and they go marching through a desert habitat. And they get into this plain, this large valley that's covered with wild sunflowers. And they say the air here is very bad from all the smokes from the Indian campfires. And they feel earthquakes. They call it Los Temblores. And they see a big tar pit in the middle, they name La Brea. Where am I? LA Basin. I'm a northerner, so I like to emphasize the bad air. Anyhow, so off they go, and they go over Ventura, and they drop into the Chumash country. Those guys with the boats, big villages. Thousands of people in each village. The first village they come to, the head man comes out and says, welcome, come. And he lays down these mats for them to sit on. Big villages, lots of people crowded around. And he feeds them and does this long harangue and speech. And the Spaniards are very patient. Meanwhile, they've sent a ship north to rendezvous at wherever Monterey is with supplies. So the expedition keeps saying, have you seen a ship? Have you seen a ship? All right, a what? Anyhow, so there they are, and great relations. They're being fed on this great fish, and Crespi's writing, these are great people. They're so kind and very nice. We'll be able to put a mission here. And they continue north, and they say farewell, and the Indians are kind of confused, like, why are they leaving? And they head north, and they get about 2 miles, and they hit another village with another leader, with new rules. They have to get fed again. Finally, Crespi writes in his diary, we're camping away from the Indians now, so that we can sleep at night. First encounters. And then continue up to Gaviota, and then they have to make a choice. Either take Highway 1 inland, or go along the coast, Point Conception. They make the bad choice, and they go through Los Padres Forest. That's up, down, down. It's rugged mountain. We let condors go there. You know what I mean? Because it's remote. So every time they drop into a valley, there's a village. California's landscape was occupied, not a wilderness at all. And so they're encountering these Indians, and now they say they look different. They speak different languages. They can see that. And they continue north to what is going to be Mission San Antonio just 2 years later. And they're still lost. And now they're running out of food. And they come down through Arroyo Seco, and they drop down to about where King City is now, finally get on the right highway, right? Salinas Valley, nice and straight. And they can smell the ocean ahead, which they're desperate to get to because they want to meet that ship. So they get all the way to the fabulous harbor of Monterey, and they go, is this it? They don't believe it. So they camp out at Cannery Road, and they send Sergeant Ortega south because they think they've passed it. South, no Highway 1. You know how rugged that is? They get to about Big Sur and say, no, that's not it. So they decide Monterey must lie ahead. So they continue north, and they go past where the Salinas River goes out now. Well, it didn't then. It used to go out by Elkhorn Slough, which wasn't a slough then. It was a brackish water lake. They called Lake of the Cranes because it was covered with egrets. And they go around it to Prunedale and drop down in a valley, and they see a village below. For the first time, the scouts are together. They're all one, so there's no warning for the village. And the men come running out of the houses going, ah, the women head for the hills. Men come out with their bows and arrows, and they stick the arrows in the ground, and they stand back. Because in native California culture, conflict, which wasn't unusual, was done by arrangement. And so they're standing there behind their arrows going, what's this? They see these guys ride up on horses, which they later mentioned at Mission Carmel. We couldn't tell the man from the horse, right? Because they'd never seen him before. And so Sergeant Ortega rides up with a bunch of glass beads, which the Indians seem to really like. And he offers them these glass beads. They won't move. And this isn't good, because the Spaniards are outnumbered by large numbers of armed tribesmen. And so Ortega gets off his horse, and he offers them some beads. Still, they won't move. Finally, he offers it on a stick, you know, give them a little distance. They won't move. This is not good. And then Ortega looks down, picks up one of these arrows that are stuck in the ground. And they start swarming around him, saying, come on in. He stumbled on the right etiquette, right? And now he's a guest. So they come in and tell women to start making food. I want you to hold that thought, because later we're going to look at what it takes to make like acorn into food. And you can just see all these guys show up. And I can just hear the women thinking, dang, there's a lot of these guys. And they didn't even have an invitation, right? In the middle of this village, they see a huge bird stuffed on a pole. Huge. Any idea what that is? They call it a royal eagle. Condors. They were common like buzzards here. And they named the place Pajaro, the village of Pajaro. And that is the name of the river that flows through Watsonville to this day. And they continue east along the foothills, and they enter a little hollow in the hills they call a little corral, corralitos. And they see their first redwood trees. They've never seen them before. Father Crespi writes, they stand tall like so many candles. What a blessing of timber. And they continue past a community called Apto, and they get past another village called Choquel, and they get to what is now downtown Santa Cruz in October 1769, but they can't feed their horses because the land's all burned. And what they don't know that we know, because there's no more Indians either to feed them, and they need the food because they're starving now. And what they don't know that we know is that it's acorn harvest time. They're up at UC Santa Cruz, gathering the acorns where the oaks are. But these guys are going, lineal. And so they're going through all these burned pasture lands. Why was the land burned? I will tell you as we progress, right? It was a land management technique to increase the seed harvest of the native grasses, to keep the forest out, improve the browse for the animals they hunted, which were primarily deer, pronghorn, and elk, Tule elk, big game herds, because they managed them. And so they continue north. They get to Rancho del Oso, big basin by the sea, and now some of the soldiers are dying. They're in very serious shape. We don't know why, but we do know that Crespi lays them out by the Parks Visitor Center and gives them supreme unction. This is it. And he says, boy, we're eating all these ripe little apples. They call manzanitas, little apples. And so the next morning, it rains on them. Think of this. Guys laid out, they're all ill. They've got no Gore-Tex or plastic, just leather and armor. And they're wet. And the next morning, these soldiers are well. So Crespi says, this is a miracle. And he names the place La Salud, good health. Well, they've had vitamin C problems, it's scurvy. So now they're getting this shot of vitamin C. Manzanitas are rich in vitamin C. And so they now have to go down on the beach to get around further north because they got this mountain range and slide in front of them. No Highway 1, remember? And so you can see Crespi put up his hassocks, at low tide, and they go up a ravine to the Nuevo Parks Visitor Center. I work for Parks, so I have to put that in. And where Crespi says, there was a well-built heathen waiting for us. Well-built, he would know the men don't wear any clothes. And so the well-built individual escorts them over some low-lying hills to a village. In the middle of a valley is a big dance house, big enough to hold 200 people. They've run into one of the most powerful of the peninsula tribes called the Kiroste. That's where we were yesterday looking with the tribe there on a project. In any case, Kiroste Valley, where the native people feed them, give them supplies. Crespi writes, these are the nicest mannered people we've met on the entire journey. And they give them guides and tell them to continue north. And so the expedition continues north. They get up to here by Pilarcitos Creek. They see a village that's hidden from sight because it's in the arroyo, right here, downtown Half Moon Bay. And then they continue northward and hit a big village there at Pillar Point, Pillar Point there. There's a lagoon. You guys know there's a marsh there? That's where the big village was. I can't even pronounce it, but I have the name. Sasasatanumno, you know, you can't pronounce these things. No one's there to tell me. They continue north to the little corral, the Corral de la Tierra, or the Corral of the Earth, which is Montera. They camp at Martini Creek. Maybe they're having martinis. And then they go over Devil's Slide on the other side to Puristac, which will then become the Sanchez Adobe. And they send some explorers to hunt deer over the hill. They get to the ridge, Sweeney Ridge, and they look out and go, whoa, what do you think they see? They see San Francisco Bay, which really is a world-class harbor. And they see campfires all around it. There are lots of people. Now they see the Farallon Islands, which they knew. And they can see Point Reyes. There's San Francisco to the north. They know they passed Monterey Bay. So they're not sure what to do. So the expedition mounts up. They go over the hill. They drop down to Crystal Springs Reservoir, which wasn't, it's the homeland of the South Chalais people. And they follow the little creek down on the hill. They call it the Little San Francisco Creek. It's called San Francisquito Creek. And they drop down to Stanford Shopping Center, where they see the big Palo Alto standing tall, the big redwoods, like a tower on the plains there. Crespi, who knows mathematics, is measuring this thing. And he's surrounded by Indians. They're all going, what is he doing? And he's giving them little earrings and trinkets and mirrors. They love it. And they're feeding these guys. And they send Sergeant Ortega to reconnoiter El Contra Costa, the other side of the bay. So he hikes through Mountain View, San Jose, and through the plains of Fremont, gets all the way up to Oakland. They can see where the Golden Gate's going to be. You can just imagine the light bulb going on and saying, good thing we didn't go that way. So they continue north, and they're stopped by another bay. Now they have to go east. And they go eastward, trying to find a way around. And they get very far to Hercules and all the refineries. And they can see a huge marshland spreading out before them. And they see snow-capped mountains in the distance, the Sierras. And they're thinking, boy, this is pretty tough. And then they start seeing hundreds of Indians on the hilltops with bows and arrows. They say, this isn't good. So they turn around, hike all the way back to Palo Alto, say, and they hike back to San Diego, where they're trying to figure out what to do when they see their ship. The ship had been blown south, way south, had a hard time working its way back up. And they used soldiers to help bring the ship in. Some of the sailors have died. And so they decide to try again. You can just imagine these guys saying, you go on the ship. No, you go on the ship. And they decide to go up, and a miracle of miracles, they arrive in Monterey just a couple weeks apart, where they established the Royal Presidio of Monterey in the year 1770. It's a ditch with sticks pointing out. And the first of 21 missions, Mission San Carlos, although San Diego still says they're the first, whatever. So San Carlos is a tule hut with an oak limb for an altar, and that is the colonial foothold. And prehistory flips into history like a switch. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, the revolution is fomenting and America's about to be born. People have been on the East Coast for a couple hundred years. With all of that, California is just now coming into history. So, from that foothold, the Spaniards begin to explore, looking for ways inland. They eventually create Mission San Antonio, 1771. Mission Dolores in San Francisco, 1776. Mission Santa Clara in 1777. And the first civilian town in California, the Pueblo of San Jose, the same year. So this is how history starts here. Half Moon Bay is dormant for a little while. And the native people practice their ways for a little while longer. So that's what's going on here. And of course, the Spaniards have no way of knowing that native people have been here since the Pleistocene. That's the Ice Age. When did people get here? In the Ice Age. How did they get here? Across the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, which was merged for hundreds of thousands of years. Because sea level was 300 feet lower because of all the glacial ice in the northern and southern hemisphere. Sea level was 300 feet lower. That means many land masses were connected. France and England were one. Thailand was connected to Borneo, Indonesia, and Java, one landmass, right? And so these are the migratory routes for people. But I'd like to point out, 60,000 years ago, people get to Australia, the Aborigines, and you know what? They have to use boats to do that on a horizon where they can't see the land. So I'd like to point out that people of the ancient times are us. They have the same intellectual capacity as we do, and they're clever. So they come here. At that time, San Francisco Bay was an oak woodland valley with lots of large animals on it, like these guys. You had Columbian mammoth, 14 foot high at the shoulder, Jefferson ground sloths, they're 12 feet high. You ever seen a sloth at a zoo? They're all neck, right? Slow claws, because they don't have any real predators until people get here. And they pretty well extirpate the ground sloth. What easy pickings. We see that once we had broad-faced bears. They were bigger than grizzly bears. We had bison antiguas. There were buffaloes too. All the animals we have now were here then too, but some were missing. Bison antiguas was huge, and they were targets for early Paleo Indians. The camel and the horse was here too, because they're North American inventions. They spread to the old world. Not everything's going one way. The moose comes into America from Asia. Things are moving back and forth. And some of the native people, by the way, go back into Asia too. So it's not a one-way street. So I wanted to point it out because from day one it's complex. And we're still pushing the calendar back, older and older. It's very complicated. And the artifacts speak to the technology. These are projectile planes used for extinct megafauna. When those animals did become extinct, these tools do disappear too as they readapt, because technology is there to meet a need. And so we see in the archaeology it's complicated. Sea level begins to rise as the earth gets warmer 10,000 years ago, and it rises rapidly. It's cataclysmic environmental change going on. As the land bridge is cut off, San Francisco Bay begins to flood and submerge. And it takes a long time for nature to reach equilibrium. So the archaeology is vague, because you see the archaeology from repetitive use of the land, which happens when landscapes become stable. So this picture is very difficult, but we know these things. Sea level stabilizes to where it is now. You know, the ocean is 3 miles away from here. The Farallon Islands were connected to the mainland when first people come. Native people have been here through 4 climatic episodes. The Pleistocene, Ice Age, the early Holocene, when it was wet. The mid-Holocene, which we're heading back to, was much warmer. And the late Holocene, where we are now, has only been like this 3,000 years, right? So when I talk about sea level stabilizing around 4,000 BC, my students kind of nod their head knowingly, yep, that was a long time ago. And I go, well, not really, because we have literature from the old world then. The first empires are being built. We know who the first world's dictator was. His name was Sargon in ancient Sumer. And you know what the first stories are about? They're about floods, because the world is flooding. And so this is all part of the scene on a global scale. Try and tie it together. So all of that requires a great deal of adjustment. San Francisco Bay, as I just say, started to stabilize. And once it does, people begin to build monumental mounds around the bay to have dry spots to which to launch their boats across the bay. They need ports. And we see trade and exchange emerge. People used to call them shell mounds, but many of them are earth mounds. Earth mounds require that somebody has the authority to tell somebody to build this. So we're looking at social complexity emerge as well. So there was a time these monumental mounds dotted the San Francisco Bay. And that's important for Half Moon Bay, because from then on, Half Moon Bay and the San Francisco Bay become shared economies. So, you know, there's the glow over the hill going on. So the bay becomes a rich habitat with lots of mazes of waterways that support shellfish and countless numbers of birds and otters. There used to be sea otters that would haul out along the stream banks. Father Font writes in 1774, the air stinks here from all the exhalations of whales in the bay. It was a very different habitat in the time. So shell mounds emerge from these mounded sites. This is one from down the coast that I have in state parks I'm working with. This site dates from 6,000 to 3,000 years ago. We're studying it now because it represents the middle Holocene, a warmer climate. And we want to know what the plants look like through the archaeology, because we get the pollens and the phytoliths, plant elements that speak of the environment. We want to know because we're going there now. And we want to see how did the land react, because we should know that. Okay, in any case, in 1909, after the University of California founded its School of Anthropology, they began to map these mounds. There were 425 of these monumental mounds around the bay. What do I mean by monumental? Well, some of them are 60 feet high, as big as a football field. And these are huge structures. So a lot of people tell me, oh, the Indians were kind of simple, weren't they? Because we don't see pyramids or standing stones. But we used to have such things. They were eliminated from our expansion as a society, and so now we've concluded they were simple people because we don't see their features anymore. We've taken them out. And if you live along San Mateo Creek by Redwood City in San Mateo, those are shell mounds all along those creeks. They built the first Victorian houses on those mounds because they drain good. So we've covered all this over. You don't see it anymore. But it once was real. That's the Emeryville mound being bulldozed away. They used these mounds for road fill and fertilizer for the fields, full of bones. And I used to know farmers in Mountain View that talked about the Castro mound. That was a huge mound. It was there until the 1960s. And they said we called it Indian topsoil fertilizer because it was full of human bones. They used it in the fields. So we've lost an enormous amount of information. That's Emeryville. That's where the Bay Bridge comes out by Berkeley. So that's the fate of our ancestral times, and so we don't see it anymore. And it took anthropologists and archaeologists to relearn this. One of my friends, Dr. Randall Milliken, wrote his dissertation and master's thesis on where the tribes were. He was the first to put a map out with all the tribes on it based on the mission registers. He just passed away 3 months ago from a brain tumor. And that's tragic because we just lost a national treasure. It's in our heads sometimes, right? And when they go, they go. He put this map together. Up until the 90s, we didn't even know. And what you're looking at are tribes. These are tribes. The Ohlone, like I said, is a catch-all term. These are tribes. So here, and yes, it is fuzzy. I got to get a new laptop. This is old technology. It's not the projector, it's the laptop. All right, so here we have the Quiroste of Año Nuevo. They were the most powerful of all the peninsula tribes. They were called a nation by the Spaniards. And they also resisted colonization, fought a guerrilla war for quite a while. They were bordered by the Ohlone. The word Ohlone comes from here, San Gregorio Creek, another tribe. You go up to Tenitas Creek and you have the Cotagani. Then you come up to where we are and you have the Chiguan, also known as Chihuahua, like an M on the end. They're locative terms like Tuolumne, Mokelumne, Yosemite. Those are locative terms in native language. Then up here we have the Salshon I mentioned, and the Lamchin, the Puichon, the Tamien, the Achista, Cotoni, and so forth. That is the political map of the area. So, as I wanted to say, we have tribes with territories. But territories are different for them than it is for us. We have a boundary and you need a passport. Okay, check. Right, the gate goes up, you can go through. Native people, their boundaries were dictated by the gardening they did. They managed this land. It was not a wilderness. I like to use a term from a famous Lakota holy man. His name was Tatanka Iotonka. You've heard of him. Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull. He once said, this landscape did not become a wilderness until the white man came. Right? They treated the land. They were always pruning, coppicing, burning to maintain productivity of the land. The reason California supported such a huge native population, other cultures we see go to agriculture. The people here learn to manage the land and manipulate it. It produced. And that's what supported the huge populations here. So these are not people wandering around like nomads. They have territories. From the day a child is born, the mother sings songs of geography. So they learn their traditional territories and what's their space and place. And the average tribe territory is about 10 by 10 square miles. Can you imagine? Everything they do, their whole lives are spent in those territories. They're not wandering around. You can't do that. You never marry in your community either. You marry out. And you do that to create networks of alliance and trade. Marriage was that. This is Randy's better map, and you know what I like about it? He didn't draw the borders edge to edge here, because he was trying to emphasize that fact, that these are not people that control entire landscapes, they manage the resources that support them. And so what you end up with is liminal space in between. That's where the animals are. That's where you hunt. Lewis and Clark found that out when they were going west, trying to find their way. The closer they got to Indian villages, the less luck they had hunting. They had to go further away from the tribes. That's where the game was. And the Indians knew that too. They needed those spaces for animals to thrive. That was all part of the awareness. So we're looking at a complex cultural landscape. And in it, we find that in the fall, they built their houses after they burned the grass, after the grass seed harvest. Used to harvest the native seeds. The grasses you see now are Mediterranean species. Native grasses have been outcompeted by the cattle that were brought in that couldn't digest the California grasses. Native California grasses are fire adapted. Fire adapted because the Indians burned it every year for millennia. And they did so because you got fresh new growth in spring. And if you burned in selected places, the animals go there for the browse. So now you can manage where the game is too. All of that's part of the cycle of life. So they would burn, and then they start building their houses in the fall. Dig a depression in the ground, put long willow stakes up and tie them together, and then thatch it with tule rush on the outside. And they lived in that through winter. Come springtime, they would go out on their landscape again for fresh greens and vegetables. They've been living on stored foods all winter, particularly acorn, which is the value of acorn because it can be stored, right? And then they burn their houses down because they're hygienic people. They want to maintain the hygiene of their community. Children learn to swim before they walk. They had bathrooms established around the village, men's and women's separate. They were very concerned about health and hygiene, which is contrary to what the Europeans thought, who themselves were not so hygienic, actually. So it's an interesting contradiction in behaviors. In fact, they thought bathing was, a gateway to illness, right? Our ancestors. Anyhow, so tule houses, and of course, I've seen many of these demonstration houses, and you look at it and go, kind of small, because I know that you've got mom and dad, the kids, crazy Aunt Mildred, maybe grandma and grandma in there, right? They're all in the same house. Well, that's a demonstration house. The real house is going to be as big or as small as necessary to support the need of the people, like that one. This was up at Clear Lake. Notice that it's a black and white photo, not an image from a painting from an ancient time. That's because native people were still doing this until quite recently. Did you ever hear of Ishi? Ishi was the last of his people. Why was he the last? Because vigilantes wiped out his people 5 times. And they lived in hiding for 40 years in the mountains. No one knew they existed. Finally, he comes out in 1911 and surrenders himself. Thinks he's going to die. But there were anthropologists by then. And they grab him up and take him to Berkeley, where he becomes an exhibit. Ishi comes out of the mountains 19 years before my dad was born. I have to point that out to people, right? So we're not talking about the geologic specimen on the shelf. We're talking about living people with living memory.
So, question. So I've been in tule houses. They're actually pretty warm and wind resistant. There aren't a lot of tules growing out here.
There were.
A lot of lake areas.
There were. So before agriculture drained all that off, there were vernal pools all along the base of these hills, which attracted immense numbers of geese and ducks, and the tules grew there. If you dig a hole in the ground around here large enough and let it sit, the tules will come up. Their rhizomes are still in the soil. And by the way, I still give permit to native people to gather tule in state parks. And I send them to the agricultural fields where the farmers have their reservoirs and they're trying to get that tule out all the time, right? In the old days, they would burn the tule thickets and they kept renewable. That's where all the bird eggs are too. Tules are important to the native people because they made boats out of them, they made houses out of them, baskets, mats, rope, cordage. They used the pollen for food and the roots for food. Tules were very important to the people. So yeah, it was good observation because the land isn't what it was. Right? So they fished. These people were avid fishermen and they used tule boats, calm days to go out.
to do that. So we find hook and line fishing, particularly these cobbles, that's what preserves, these rocks with a groove on them. And they use dog baiting cordage because it's saltwater resistant. You can't find dog baiting anymore except at the Filoli estate where there's a big patch. And tribal people go there for it because it's hard to find now. The farmers got rid of it because it wasn't so good for the cattle. But they used to make string out of that. Here's a thought. To make a small net, it takes about 1,700 stalks of dog bane. You have to coppice it. The elders tell us you cut it at the base after the first frost. Not before, not later, because that hardens it and gets it just right. It's a pithy stalk and you can pull the fibers off. I teach my students how to make string. Now my son's doing it. He's working for state parks too. Who thought? You know, for video game teaching people. Anyhow, so they had hook and line fishing. You know, to get that many stalks of dog bane for a net, you're not going to wander around like there's one. You know, they're managing this. And they want that to grow. So we're seeing a form of agriculture that most of us went and missed. The problem with Native American agriculture and growing things is they didn't put fences around it. So Europeans didn't see it, right? So in any case, kelp is very good. I've been out with homos up at Fort Ross where they'll go out on the surf still and pull out the kelp and they put them on flat rocks and roast them on hearths and exchange them to the inland tribes still. Birds, sea mammals, crustaceans, very rich habitats on the coastal edge. So the people were very keen on that. Shellfish was very important. We see different species on San Francisco Bay than along the peninsula here. And they serve like dye in the water for me. I can see who's going where by the kind of shellfish they leave behind, right? So urchins, and I just threw these in as random specimens. Pretty much every kind of shellfish you can imagine was food. But these were really important. Turban snails, a little butter and garlic, they're not too bad. Limpets. Mussels were the dominant food, both bay mussels and ocean mussels. If you see middens around here, you'll see they're dominated by mussel shell. And that, what's that? Thank you, you just spoke an Ohlone word. It comes from the Monterey dialect. And the Spaniards turned it into abalorio. And then these guys are called olive snails, or olivella. They have no dietary value whatsoever. They are the root for making shell money. If people had money, I'll talk about that. Coinage. Oh, those simple onions, right? Credit, debt, poor people, rich people. We didn't invent any of that stuff. And I'll talk more about bead money, because those who have the beads, particularly the Corostia de Año Nuevo, are sitting on the bank. And I've learned they regulate the flow of that to the interior to keep the value up. We'll visit that again. And now you know they have coin. So they also fished in the streams. The migratory steelhead and coho were caught with traps, basket traps and harpoons. And then on the bay itself, they traded, and off here too, for sea otters. I always point this out. I'm really proud of my computer skill here. 1816 watercolor, my picture of an otter. Looking good. Anyhow, otters were very, very important. I excavated several sites near Fitzgerald Marine Reserve over the years. We have several sites, like Costanera restaurant there. One of them is falling into the sea, and I've tested it. We have found human remains there, so we're not doing any more with that. And don't go dig it up, it's illegal. It's a felony to dig up Native American graves, just saying, never mind ethics. But we have that site there, and I've tested it, and it's loaded with sea otter bones, full. And what's interesting about the sea otter bones is they're skeletally complete. What that means is they're not harvesting them for their meat. They actually are harvesting them for their fur. So they did wear furs, although most of the time men are not wearing any clothes at all, which means they need a high-fat diet to keep their metabolism up. I'll touch on that again later. So otters are very important. Hook and line fishing, this is an assemblage of different kinds of fish hooks. And you fishermen in there and you out here can kind of appreciate that. So they're picking up lots of different creatures of the sea. These are elk antler harpoons. They're carved with stone tools, and they're about that long. And these are from the bay shore, primarily, right opposite here, where the people would go into the marshes, the bay sloughs and estuaries, and they'd sit there with their boats, and they were anchored to a post. The first visitors to the bay, Europeans, say there were these posts all over the mud flats. and decorated, and they said they were markers for the fishermen. And sure enough, so what they would do is moor their tule boats near one of these posts in the estuaries, and they'd have these spears with these ends, these harpoons on the end, and they're probing the muddy bottom with them. They're trying to perforate bat rays and stingrays and pull them up. And we find these are from the Ohlone State up on the hill here. And so they're the spines, the tail spine. So we see that.
Question, in that previous picture,
Yeah.
fish hooks, were those put together with tar from tar heaps?
Yeah, they used asphaltum. There's Tar Creek near here. Also at Annual, it washes up. And I found pallets of abalone shells full of this tar. They export it out, and it dries hard, but you can heat it up, it becomes liquid. And they use it as an adhesive. In this particular case, they're covering up the knots to make the string watertight. Thank you for asking. I like the details, right? So at any rate, hunting sea mammals was important, and I do a lot of these studies, particularly at Annie Nuevo, where we find stellar sea lion, California sea. Ever seen a stellar sea lion? Can you imagine jamming him with a stick? You know? Anyhow, they've got them, they've got harbor seals, they have northern fur seals, which don't even haul out anymore, but there's one species missing. Elephant seals, not a one, and the docents hate to hear this. And sorry, they show up in the 50s and take over a vacant niche and begin to breed. They're all genetically like, well, there are only two, there were 4 left in California. They thought to be extinct. And they show up at Annie Nuevo, which prompted the purchase of Annie Nuevo from the Steele family. I knew Catherine Steele when she was in her 90s. Any rate, that was the Steele family ranch. And so now the elephant seal has proliferated. They spilled out to San Simeon. Caltrans has a problem down there, and they're on Highway 1. They're at Jenner, but they're all genetically alike because they're all from that one breeding pair. So interesting, isn't it? And it's a marvelous success story, but like our ecologists pull out invasive weeds, we keep saying, what about the elephant seal? You know, right? That's a different subject. Anyhow, I love them dearly, but they are the primary adverse effect to my archaeological sites. They're like bulldozers, digging it up, competing, and then they just ground them down. These sites have all been blowing out. I've spent 30 years recovering data from these sites, many of which are now beaches. They're gone. So anyhow, projectile points, just to tell you about technology, the bow and arrow is recent. It comes in around 1100 AD. For 10, 15,000 years, people are using darts or atlatls. A dart is like a giant arrow with a hole in the end of the shaft that fits into a hook on a board. That's an extension of your arm, so you can hurl those things and bring down big animals. So the projectile points themselves are rather robust. You ever seen the National Park Rangers, which are, you can tell next time you see one of those guys, that's not an arrowhead, that's a dart. And they'll go, oh. Anyhow, these are darts. So these are coastal from this area, and they're from 6,000 to 3,000 years ago. Then around 1000 BC, there are great changes going on in California. We start seeing the introduction of mortar and pestle for acorns because people start becoming territorial. And as they become territorial, you start having to manipulate the land in your territory more. As you will learn, acorns are toxic foods. They require a high handling cost, rich in carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, but a lot of tools necessary to manage them. We'll talk about that too. Early on, people do have a wider range of mobility, and they're harvesting the grass seeds from the meadows primarily. So about 1000 BC, these become in vogue. These are made from Annie Nuevo. These are called Monterey chert. The material is a flint from Annie Nuevo, which becomes an industrial center. It's manufactured and spreads out. So around Half Moon Bay, the earlier sites will be dominated by this material. And these points are like Swiss Army knives before the bow and arrow shows up. Around 800 to 900 AD, we have a drought, a big drought. It's called the medieval climatic anomaly. It goes on for 300 years. Ever been to the Four Corners area and you see the cliff dwellings? Those are cool. They make my archaeology look pretty marginal. Anyhow, and then you read the Anasazi disappeared. Why did they disappear? It's because it dried up. And the roots of their crops dried up. And so there's cataclysmic collapse going on. By the way, the Pueblo people of today, like the Hopi, are those people. So they just change. right? But you see cannibalism in places like that where people are under stress. And in the Bay Area here, the opposite happens because we have a beautiful mosaic of alternate resources. So people change the menu, right? So the bow and arrow comes roaring in, and they're technologically complex tools. They made short, wide bows, and they glued deer tendon on the back. In fact, the wood was almost just a shell for the tendon on it, and they have very powerful pulls. Beautiful bows made out of juniper, yew, wild plum, mahogany, a lot of woods we don't have, so they're buying them from others. And the arrows themselves, you can't grow an arrow shaft straight. You have to go to the plants like toyon and even poison oak and willow, and they cut them, and in a year or two, you get straight shoots, and then you can harvest them. So everything they do has a lot of forethought. Later we talk about baskets, okay? So making these tools are important. Now archaeologically, we only find the business in, and we study these, but you miss all of that technology that's also going on. The best bows and arrows are in Russia, along with the baskets and feather gear that we don't have, because the Russians were trading with the Indians here, not conquering, and the Indians gave them high status gifts. Some friends of mine recently went there to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, their Smithsonian, and they finally got into the California stuff that the explorers were bringing back. And they published a book in 2015 through Altamira Press called Treasures of Native California. And you can get it on Amazon, and I'll tell you what, it's beautiful, because the Russians got the good stuff. Anyhow, we got the stones and bones. So anyhow, obsidian, oh, what's this all about? It's an advertisement on my computer. Go away. Okay, I hope I didn't do something that's going to black this thing out. All right, obsidian was very valuable to these people. They cherished it because it doesn't require a lot of management. It's sharp. Obsidian is glass. It's volcanic glass. It can get down to 1 micron thickness. It's sharper than a scalpel, right? But there are no volcanoes here. Obsidian has to be bought from far, far away. And these guys got the money to do it. And so we find obsidian come to Half Moon Bay from very distant places. Each obsidian flow has its own chemical fingerprint, and we have fingerprinted all the obsidian flows in the West. So when I get obsidian points here, I can take them to a specialist who puts them through a spectrograph, and you get a readout of its content, and we can match them to where they came from. And so we can reconstruct prehistoric trade routes, and the obsidian here is coming from 2 geographic regions. One is Clear Lake, Napa Valley. You ever drive there? You know how long that is across a bridge? Right? So it's coming over the bay in boats. And then the other source is Casa Diablo, Mono Glass Mountain. That's in the Great Basin, the other side of Yosemite. Right? That's the obsidian exchange. By one neighbor to another, by the time it gets here, it's pretty pricey stuff. And it can't go any farther because you got the ocean. This is a drop-off point right here. So when you find obsidian points out here, they become really good for the archaeologists to look at prehistoric trade networks. Very valuable. So native people here, the men did not wear clothes. This is kind of funny for me because Crespi writes his diary. They're so fair-skinned. He's got these rose-colored glasses. And, our society is very hung up on that, right? And then you see this Louis Charry picture from 1816. Charry was a French watercolor artist on board a French ship. In the day before cameras, you had naturalists who painted the things they saw. And that's what he did. He was 21 years old. So he pulls into Mission Dolores where the French are actually spying, but the Spaniards were so glad to see another European, they say, come on in, and so he paints the native people. These are the people from up here on the peninsula. And what you see are the men aren't wearing any clothes. And so a lot of my students are sort of not so culturally aware and find that sort of shocking and go, well, how come they don't wear any clothes? And so we automatically assume, well, they must be primitive. That's not what's going on at all. We're used to Plains Indians with their buckskins and fringes, riding around on horses, hunting buffalo. That's a pretty brief culture, by the way, when the horse comes in, right? Here you have people living in small territories. The animal herds are in those territories. Clothing retains your scent. So what they learned was to keep clean, bodily, and hide your human scent. And when they were ready to hunt, they would put a deer head and a cape of a deer, and they'd go out into the herd, and they knew where the herd was because they were spot burning selectively close to the village, and that attracted the game to the new growth. So you reduce your caloric loss of searching for the animal because you're preparing places for them. And so then you can hunt, and they get so close to the animals, they're like wolves. They get really close, because these deer, they don't see so good. They can hear pretty good, and they can smell things, so you go a certain angle in the wind, and you act like the animal, pawing the ground, and you got your quiver and bow and arrow, and then you can pop up and fire, and they can pick their target, and like wolves do. And that's key to maintaining the health of a herd. Also, you don't shoot the alpha male, or the herd disperses and your neighbors benefit, right? So they're actually managing. And from this, we get a clue on how people around the world probably started domestication of animals, because there are all these same trajectories in all our cultures. All of us lived like this once upon a time. My family's from Holland. When I go to Europe and look at paleo cultures there, I see mortars and pestles and harpoons. Looks identical. And they're harvesting acorn too. You know what I mean? So it's us in a lot of ways. So California is famous for anthropologists to study native people, because it's still going on until quite recently. And from that, we get a window into our own pasts. So what's really cool about these guys is you see the sinew-back bow, a quiver made out of silver fox. They were tubular, because you can't pull the points out. And they have these deer sharpening tools, because these tools get dull. You have to sharpen and chip the edges on these stone tools to keep them sharp. And they put them in their ears because they don't have any pockets. So here's an example of a man from Los Banos in the 1930s demonstrating to the anthropologist. They would go into a sweat lodge, which is like a sauna. They kept the bows and arrows in the rafters to keep the human scent off. And they would pray to take the life of the animal. And when they did, they would go out into the field, clean, spiritually correct, to harvest the animal. There were prohibitions. If your wife was on her moon time, you couldn't hunt. If you were raising an infant, you couldn't hunt. Other people would provide for you. There are all kinds of rules of behavior on when it was okay to hunt and when it wasn't. So this is what was primarily on the menu. All the animals were food, but elk, deer, pronghorn were once dominant on the landscape. So big meat packages for people. That's me going into a herd of elk and going, whoa, they're kind of big. You ever seen an elk? If you do, you're looking eye to eye with them, right? So my students are like, oh, they ate this, they ate that. Yeah, I got to check. Wait a minute. Let's put ourselves in their moccasins, if you will. So there you are, there they are, there's your dinner, and you got this long stick with a flint on the end of it. You're going to jam him with that thing? Do you know what he's going to do? He's going to be angry. And so hunting is dangerous. And so actually the predominant foods are vegetable foods. Hunting is additive to your diet. I'd like to tell you about grizzly bears too. This area was loaded with grizzly bears. When Indians were removed from the landscape, the wildlife went. There were so many grizzly bears here once upon a time. The first Americans who take over Spanish Town say, we were afraid to go out at night for all the bears that were here. The Indians called them Oresh. You ever seen a grizzly bear? I went to Yellowstone a few years ago, and to my surprise, I saw them 3 different times. Twice, they were stalking full-grown buffalo. And I'm thinking, I'm never hiking there. So what was it like? Let's take 10 minutes and stretch for a minute, and then I'll continue, okay?